The British Empire once ruled a quarter of the entire planet. The Soviet Union had the largest standing army in human history. The United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. All 3 of them went into Afghanistan. All 3 of them left without winning. So the question is not why countries keep invading Afghanistan. The question is why Afghanistan keeps breaking them. Afghanistan does not look like a superpower killer on paper. It has no significant navy, no advanced air force. Its GDP ranks among the lowest 20 nations in the world. It has almost no heavy industry, no nuclear weapons, and no global financial leverage. And yet, for 2.5 millennia, it has swallowed armies whole. The answer has nothing to do with military technology. It has everything to do with geography, tribal structure, strategic patience, and a culture of resistance so deeply embedded in the population that it has outlasted every single empire that ever tried to erase it. Start with the land. Afghanistan sits at the crossroads of Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, which is exactly why every empire in history has wanted it. Control Afghanistan and you control the ancient trade routes connecting China, India, Persia, and Europe. But wanting it and holding it are 2 completely different things. The Hindu Kush mountain range runs across nearly 2/3 of the country, with peaks rising above 24,000 feet. Valleys are narrow, roads are scarce. Supply lines stretch for hundreds of miles through terrain that can turn a military operation into a catastrophe overnight. The land was designed almost perfectly to break invaders. Modern military analysts use a specific term for terrain like this: anti-access area denial environment. It means the geography itself neutralizes an invader's greatest advantages. A tank column is nearly useless in the Korengal Valley. Air superiority means little when fighters disappear into mountain passes with no satellite coverage. Even with GPS, drones, and precision munitions, the United States military found that identifying, targeting, and holding ground in Afghanistan's mountain regions was one of the most difficult challenges its forces had faced in a generation. The British found the same thing in 1842. The Soviets found the same thing in 1985. The mountain doesn't care what century you're fighting in. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great, fresh off destroying the Persian Empire, pushed east into the region now known as Afghanistan. He had never lost a battle. His army had conquered everything from Greece to Egypt to Persia. In Afghanistan, he won battles again and again, and it meant almost nothing. Local resistance forces, Bactrians and Sogdians, refused to submit. They retreated into the mountains, launched raids, disappeared, and returned. Alexander spent 3 full years trying to pacify a region he had already conquered. He eventually married a local Bactrian princess, Roxana, in what many historians read as a political admission that force alone was not enough. Here is the political reality every invading power has eventually been forced to confront. Afghanistan has never functioned as a single centralized nation in the Western sense of the word. It is a mosaic: Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, Turkmen, Baloch, and dozens of sub-tribal divisions beneath them, each with its own leadership structure, its own code of honor, and its own understanding of who holds legitimate authority. There is no single capital you can capture, no single leader you can remove, no single institution you can replace that will hand you control of the whole country. When you capture Kabul, you have captured a city. You have not captured Afghanistan. Among the Pashtun people, roughly 42% of the population, there exists a code of conduct called Pashtunwali. It is older than Islam, older than any government, older than any empire that has tried to rule this land. Pashtunwali demands loyalty to family and tribe above all else. It requires protection of any guest who enters your home, and it demands revenge, badal, for any dishonor inflicted.
This is not a law that a constitution can override. It is not a religious code that a new government can repeal. It is a way of life passed down for thousands of years, and it makes submitting to a foreign occupying power not just politically unacceptable, but a fundamental violation of who you are.
In 1839, the British Empire, at the absolute peak of its global power, invaded Afghanistan. The goal was to install a ruler friendly to British interests and block Russian expansion into Central Asia. This geopolitical competition between Britain and Russia was known as the Great Game. Afghanistan was the board they fought over. Initially, the British succeeded. Kabul was taken, a new king was installed. British officers settled in, brought their families, and began behaving as though the occupation would last forever. Then came January 1842. Surrounded, freezing, and cut off from supplies, a British Indian army of approximately 16,500 soldiers and civilians began a retreat from Kabul toward Jalalabad.
Afghan fighters attacked the column relentlessly through narrow mountain passes in brutal winter conditions. Of the 16,500 who began that retreat, one man reached Jalalabad alive. One man. British Army surgeon Dr. William Brydon, exhausted, wounded, riding a dying horse, arrived at the gates of Jalalabad alone. This event, known as the Massacre of Elphinstone's Army, sent shockwaves through the British Empire and became one of the most catastrophic military disasters in the history of Western colonialism. Britain returned to Afghanistan twice more, in 1878 and 1919. Each time it left without achieving lasting control. Eventually, Britain simply called Afghanistan a buffer state, a diplomatic way of admitting it could not be held.
"140 years after the British disaster, the Soviet Union made the same mistake. In December 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan to prop up a collapsing communist government in Kabul. The Soviet military was the largest conventional fighting force on Earth. Its commanders expected the operation to take a matter of months. Soviet General Secretary Brezhnev reportedly told advisors the mission would be over in 3 to 4 weeks. It lasted 9 years, 1 month, and 18 days. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. More than 35,000 were wounded. The human cost on the Afghan side was incomparably worse. Between 1 and 2 million Afghan civilians died.
The Afghan Mujahideen fought the Soviets using the same tactics that had defeated the British a century earlier: guerrilla warfare, mountain ambushes, strategic patience. But this time, they had a powerful sponsor. The United States, through the CIA, funded and armed the Mujahideen in one of the largest covert operations in American history, codenamed Operation Cyclone. At its peak, the CIA was funneling over $630 million per year into the Afghan resistance, including Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that neutralized Soviet air superiority in the mountains. By 1989, the Soviets withdrew. Many historians argue this defeat directly accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union, which ceased to exist 2 years later, in 1991.
On September 11, 2001, nearly 3,000 Americans were killed in the deadliest terrorist attack in the history of the United States. The Taliban government in Afghanistan had provided sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, the organization behind the attacks. Within weeks, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom. American and NATO forces, supported by Afghan Northern Alliance fighters, overthrew the Taliban government in just 2 months. By December 2001, Kabul had fallen, Taliban leadership had fled to Pakistan, and the operation appeared decisive. American officials spoke of rebuilding Afghanistan, of democracy, institutions, a new future. The world watched and waited. Then, the years started passing. What followed was the longest war in American history.
Over 2,400 U.S. military personnel were killed. More than 20,000 were wounded. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, one of the most rigorous academic analyses of the conflict, the United States spent approximately $2.3 trillion on the war in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021. $2.3 trillion. Despite this, the Afghan government, built with American support, could not sustain itself. The Taliban, driven out in 2 months in 2001, retook Kabul in August 2021, less than 2 weeks after the final American withdrawal began. 20 years, $2.3 trillion. The outcome in 2021 looked almost identical to 2001.
American commanders have been remarkably candid since the withdrawal. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, a U.S. government watchdog, published reports concluding that the fundamental problem was not lack of resources or military capability. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of Afghan society. The United States tried to build Western-style institutions, a central government, a national army, a professional police force, in a society where loyalty has always run along tribal lines, not institutional ones. When American forces left, those institutions collapsed, not because Afghans lacked courage, but because those institutions had no roots in the actual social fabric of the country. The blueprint was imported, the foundation was never built.
There is a principle consistent across centuries of military analysis. A guerrilla force does not need to win battles, it only needs to not lose the war. The invading force must win decisively and then maintain control indefinitely. That is an exhausting and enormously expensive proposition. The defending force simply needs to survive long enough for the invader to give up. This strategic asymmetry has destroyed empire after empire in Afghanistan. The British could not afford to hold indefinitely. The Soviets could not sustain the human and financial cost. The Americans reached the same conclusion after 20 years. Time, not technology, is Afghanistan's ultimate weapon, and the people defending the land have always had more of it.
Here is the great and terrible irony at the center of this story. The United States armed, funded, and helped train the Mujahideen to defeat the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Some of those same networks and the ideology built around that decade of CIA-supported jihad later became the foundation of both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The weapons supplied to defeat the Soviets were later pointed at American soldiers. The guerrilla warfare training the U.S. helped provide in the 1980s became the playbook used against American forces in the 2000s and 2010s. Afghanistan didn't just defeat the Soviet Union, it used American help to do it, and then used what it learned to outlast America itself.
Every empire that entered Afghanistan made a version of the same fundamental mistake. They calculated military force, they calculated financial investment, they calculated exit strategies and timelines. What they failed to calculate, what they consistently and catastrophically underestimated, was the weight of history that every Afghan carries. When British soldiers arrived in 1839, Afghans already remembered the Persians, the Greeks, the Mongols. When Soviet soldiers arrived in 1979, Afghans remembered the British. When American soldiers arrived in 2001, Afghans remembered the Soviets. Every invading army walks in believing it will be different. Every invading army eventually discovers it is not.
The phrase "graveyard of empires" is sometimes criticized by historians as an oversimplification, and they have a point. Not every empire that entered Afghanistan was literally destroyed. Britain survived, the United States still exists. But the phrase captures something real. Afghanistan does not destroy empires in a single battle. It destroys them slowly, through cost, attrition, humiliation, and the dawning realization that there is no version of this conflict that ends the way you imagined when you first sent your armies in. It is not the graveyard of armies, it is the graveyard of certainty. The certainty that force alone is enough. The certainty that superior technology guarantees victory. The certainty that you understand a place you only just arrived in.
Afghanistan is not powerful in the ways the modern world measures power. It has no stock exchange that can crash global markets, no nuclear arsenal threatening cities, no navy that can blockade trade routes. What it has is something older and harder to measure. Mountains that have stood for 50 million years, a people who've been defending their land longer than most nations have existed, and a history that keeps repeating the same lesson, one that the world's most powerful nations keep learning the hard way. You can invade Afghanistan, you can win every single battle, and you can still lose the war.
If this video changed how you think about Afghanistan or about what power actually means, leave a comment below. Here is what I want to know. Which part of this history surprised you most? Was it the 1842 British retreat where 16,500 soldiers entered and one man came out alive? Was it the fact that the CIA armed the very networks that later fought America? Or was it simply this, that a country with no navy, no air force, and almost no economy has outlasted the three greatest military powers of the last 200 years? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe if you want more history that explains the world you are living in right now. Because the most important news today almost always started centuries ago. See you in the next one.